Welcome to the Filibuster, the podcast of the Union University Political Science Department. The Senate filibuster is the right to unlimited debate. This means that senators could speak nonstop on the floor with the hope of changing fellow senators' minds and or reaching and persuading a broader audience. Because of this, some call the Senate the world's greatest deliberative body. But unlike the Senate filibuster, we will place a limit on our discussion while being a forum of civil debate and discussion of major issues from our academic, political, historical, and Christian perspectives. Our topic today is the Iran and U.S. war negotiation, whatever we want to call it. My name is Sean Evans, and I will be the host, and I will be joined by my usual participant, Seth Brake, our international relations professor. Welcome, Seth.
Thank you so much.
And we're also bringing into our podcast Christopher Jones, who is a history professor here. So he is becoming the second non-political scientist to participate in our broadcast, our podcast, I guess. Christopher has been here 3 years. He has a PhD in history from Columbia, and his expertise is the ancient Mesopotamian and Mediterranean world. So he'll have a perspective on Iran and everything else. He does have a degree in archaeology. So when you say Dr. Jones, you may think of Indiana Jones. To the best of my knowledge, he has not found the Ark of the Covenant before, but he did have reptiles, snakes, and birds, and a whole bunch of other things growing up, which makes you a little bit like Indiana Jones traversing across jungles and everything else. Welcome, Christopher.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, sure. Our pleasure. All right. So, Christopher, let's start with you since your expertise is in that area of the world. So, many people listening were not alive at the time of the Iranian Revolution in 1979. In fact, I'm the only one of the three who can remember this. Would you give us the 411 on the revolution and its after effects?
So the revolution of 1978, 1979 is a really difficult thing to understand because the kinds of things that you would expect to lead to a revolution were not present. Iran's economy was booming. The country was developing. It's really hard to overstate how impoverished Iran was in the early 20th century. I mean, the country had less than 1,000 hospital beds in the entire country.
Wow.
Yeah. The army in World War I was still armed with, percussion cap muzzle loaders. But as oil prices went up and demand for oil grew, the king of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, or the Shah, as he's often called, heavily invested in modernizing the country. But it kind of produced two different Irans. You had, on one hand, Iran was a fairly prosperous country. It was modern. It was westernizing. Women went around without headscarves. Education was being heavily promoted. But on the other hand, you still had a lot of conservative Muslims who did not like many of these changes related to women's rights, related to efforts by the Shah to kind of draw on the ancient Persian Empire. For example, he replaced the Islamic calendar with a calendar that marked years since the accession of Cyrus the Great in 556 BC. He held huge celebrations to what he called the 2,500 years of Persian monarchy. And there were clerics who were harshly critical of this. And they, the most famous was the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. And an Ayatollah is a senior Shia Muslim religious leader. And He gained a following among the poor and the landless, especially in the cities, because one effect of this land reform had been that a lot of people had, there was an effort to promote land ownership, break up the power of large landlords that the Shah had pushed, but a lot of people, as soon as they got title to their land, they sold it, and they moved to cities, and they became a kind of poor urban class, and these were kind of Khomeini's base of support. The beginning, Khomeini was exiled in 1963 for criticizing the government. He was moved to Iraq, and his sermons were distributed on cassette tapes and
All right.
underground publications within Iran. But what started the protest movement was in January 1978, government newspaper published an editorial sharply critical of Khomeini, and really accusing him of working with the group that the Shah actually feared the most, which wasn't the Islamists, it was the communists. There were protests in his hometown of Qom, and government fired on the protesters, and that just started a movement that just kind of snowballed throughout the year. Every time, 40 days later, there's a funeral. After somebody gets killed, it becomes an occasion for more protests, and that just keeps it going. And the Shah starts to make concessions to the demonstrators. He starts to restore some of the democratic institutions that he had suspended in the 1950s. And all this does is it encourages people that if they keep pushing more, they'll get more. So later on that year, you get an alliance between Islamists and classical liberals and leftists that are making the protests grow to a massive size. By December, you had 10% of the country's population protesting. And you start to see protests, soldiers desert to the demonstrators. And, the Shah was unwilling to do what, the current Islamic Republic has done, which is slaughter people in the streets to suppress the protests. So he fled the country. And Khomeini then, returns from exile and manages to politically outmaneuver everybody else. So, within a few years, most of the leftists that had supported the revolution were dead or in prison or in exile, and Khomeini's left with unquestioned power.
Okay, so how did the revolution impact its relations with other nations in the Middle East and with the U.S.?
Yeah, it transformed everything. Now, I'll start with the Gulf states.
Okay.
They had never been on super friendly terms with Iran.
Right, because Iran was Persian, not Arab, and they were Shiite, not Sunni, are two of the major reasons, yes.
Those are exactly why. But the the Islamists takeover by Khomeini raised fears that he would attempt to spread the revolution to other Shia populations. So Iraq was the country that was the most concerned about this, right? Because it's a Shia majority country, but the Ba'athist government of Saddam Hussein was mostly Sunni. And so they really feared a revolution from the Shia population, and that's really what's driving Saddam when he orders the invasion of Iran. A year after the revolution,
which I believe the U.S. supported.
It's been overstated.
Okay.
I wouldn't say we were upset about it, but the U.S. was not exactly on. Didn't exactly see Saddam Hussein as a a partner and ally, just someone potentially useful.
Right. So he was the enemy of my enemy then.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Probably the most dramatic change with Middle East relations is Iran and Israel, because the Shah and Israel they'd never formally established diplomatic relations, but they were on friendly terms because they were two non-Arab states in the Middle East at a time when pan-Arab nationalism was the reigning ideology. And so, Israel had long had this strategy called the periphery strategy, where they try to make alliances with non-Arab states in the Middle East. So, in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, that meant Turkey and Iran and Ethiopia. But those all fell by the wayside eventually for other reasons. And in Iran, it was because Khomeini's ideology was deeply opposed to their, a Jewish state existing in formerly Muslim-ruled lands.
Okay, so how did Iran and the U.S. get onto such bad terms? I mean, I can remember the invasion of the U.S. embassy, the capture of the hostages there. So I know we were supporters of the Shah, but we were also supporters of the interim government there for a while. So what happened here?
Yeah, it's complicated, and the best way I think to understand it is that the takeover of the embassy was a power move by Khomeini and his supporters. Right? It wasn't government forces that stormed the embassy. It was a militia made up of students who were Khomeini loyalists. So Khomeini actually they hadn't set up the current government system yet. Khomeini had appointed a prime minister, Mehdi Bazargan, back in February of 1979, right when he returned to Iran. But Bazargan actually, he had a lot of disagreements with Khomeini. He wanted Iran to become a democratic country. So in some ways, the embassy takeover isolated Bazargan, because Bazargan actually ordered the militia to let the hostages go and get out of the embassy, and they refused to do it. So then he resigned in protest, and that left Khomeini kind of running the show.
Okay, and so what happened was that there was a clash of that Iran was undermining what we saw as U.S. interests by being a threat to stability in the Middle East or other things?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Yeah, so
we had a
right. So
I have resolved it. Go ahead.
Right. Okay. So we fixed the question there. So the idea is then, what led to that break with us? Were they a threat to our interest? Was it a fear of more trouble in the Middle East? Why did we get on such bad terms with them?
Well, after the revolution, I mean, the Shah was pretty close to a U.S. ally at the time. We widely supported the Shah. We worked with the Shah. In some ways, different presidents were more close to the Shah than others. Like Nixon was closer than some people before, and definitely after, right? But that relationship between that kind of personalist relationship between some U.S. presidents and the Shah led to some collaboration that then was immediately severed. And I think this has some implications for today, too, as we think about Trump's style of foreign policy, because when you have a president whose foreign policy depends on the personal relationship between the president and other leaders, there are some things they can do that you couldn't otherwise do, and then there are also some pretty obvious drawbacks. And I think when you lose the leader and that relationship gets severed, you can have something like what happened in Iran in a total flip.
So was this a little bit of the friend of my enemy is my enemy then?
Well, yeah. Yeah. But also just sometimes you get a new enemy. I mean,
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, according to the Islamic Republic leaders themselves, were afraid the embassy was going to be used as a base to stage a coup that would return the Shah to power.
Well, and that's not a completely unwarranted fear either,
which
because
is
of 54. Right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. That's exactly what had happened before, right?
Right.
Okay, explain why it happened in 54.
So,
52, did I get that?
Well, 50s, all right.
Yeah. Well, we participated in a coup to overthrow the government of Iran back then.
And was that when Shah Pahlavi took over, or
politically, yes. I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think he existed in their system before that. He was just a lot less powerful.
So he had been put into power during World War II. Right. So the British and the Soviet Union were afraid that his father, the founder of the Pahlavi dynasty, was going to ally with the Germans. So they preemptively invaded Iran and removed him from power.
Okay.
So some of the most obscure battles of World War II were in August 1941 and a joint Soviet-British invasion of Iran, which lasted about a week. The Iranian military was not strong then. What happened in the 1950s is Iran was a constitutional monarchy. They had an elected parliament at the time. They'd had one since 1906. And the 1950 election was won by a nationalist leader named Mohammad Mossadegh. And Mossadegh's big campaign promise was to nationalize the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, or as you know it today, British Petroleum. Or BP for those of you who didn't know what the acronym stood for. But they had a very favorable contract to control all of Iran's oil fields. So they had since, I think 1908. And Mossadegh nationalized the company. And Britain responded with economic sanctions to try to convince him to back down, and Mossadegh responded by convincing the Majlis to give him the power to rule by decree. And
the Majlis is the
parliament of Iran, yes. And so, Mossadegh was turning himself into a dictator. British and American intelligence agencies were plotting his overthrow, and they helped Iranian military officers stage a coup in August 1953 that overthrew Mossadegh, replaced him with a new prime minister. The Shah had actually fled the country briefly because the coup he thought it had failed. But it succeeded. And after that, he never felt quite secure. That's when he was, abolishing democracy practically after that point.
So basically they are replacing one potential dictator with another one, and then the overthrow leads to another dictator then.
But this is why discussion about regime change in Iran is so prickly, because we participated in one, then one happened very much to our detriment, and now there's discussion of, or at least Trump was talking like we were going to try and do a third.
Okay, so let me ask this, Seth. I mean, we're still getting some background information to understand what's going on. Iran has been referred to as the largest sponsor of state terror. So what do people mean by that, and why did they start along this route?
So this gets back to what Chris was talking about with the different ability for Iran to use the different Shia populations of countries to its political power, right? And Iran uses a network of militia groups in mostly Iraq, but also notably in a few other places. Hezbollah is one of their one of the ones they work most closely with, right?
And they're in Lebanon.
Yes, that's right, in Lebanon, which is going to become a really important part of this conversation in a minute. But also, they've been working with more and more disparate groups, sometimes groups that are less and less ideologically aligned with them. Like they have worked now with Hamas in the lead up to the October 7th attacks. They work with the Houthis in Yemen. So what
are the Houthis Shia?
Yes, they are.
Okay.
But they're a very different beast than a lot of the other militia groups they work with. But yes, they are there. but Iran has been able to use those religious connections and political connections to build a fairly large network of militias throughout the Middle East. So that this is where that title of largest state sponsor of terror comes from. But also in the war in Iraq, many U.S. soldiers died in battles with these Iranian-backed groups, which has led to a lot of U.S. public. I mean, that has a lot of salience on the U.S. public. If Americans have died in some of these things, so that's also where that connection comes from. So when we say state sponsor of terror, I think a lot of people might assume something like Al Qaeda,
right?
And that's not really what Iran is doing there, but it is still, I think, an accurate label.
So let me ask this, and either one of you can answer this. So I know historically there are different nations in the Middle East trying to exercise influence. Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Iran, Iraq. So does this go back to the idea of that Iran is using its influence with proxies to try to increase its power in the Middle East itself?
Oh, absolutely. But in some ways, that's just good foreign policy on their part. There are some strategic similarities between Israel and Iran, in that they're both a country that speaks a different language than the people around them, has a different religion than the people around them, feels always surrounded and embattled, has to prove themselves at their founding through war, things like that. So all the things that we're accustomed to thinking about with Israel, I think also apply to Iran in the Middle East.
So are they trying to export an ideology of some sort, or is this just simple power politics?
I'll let Chris get back to the ideological part there more importantly, because there is something there, especially during the revolution and around the revolution. I think right now, though, they're trying to export whatever they can to survive politically.
Okay.
They're very pragmatic at the moment.
All right, Christopher.
I think, the clearest example of an ideological export you get is the formation of Hezbollah in Lebanon in the early 1980s. The Shia population in Lebanon, you have, even before the revolution, preachers in the same vein as Khomeini, kind of laying the groundwork there. And then it's in 1982 thereabouts that Iran starts to deploy intelligence agents into the Bekaa Valley that start to organize Shia militia groups.
That's in Lebanon, right?
In Lebanon, yes.
Right down the Lebanese-Syrian border.
Lebanese-Syrian border, yes. And that was around the time of... Lebanon had been in a civil war since 1975.
Right.
Lasted from 1975 to 1990.
I guess we could say it's probably still going on some level, though it's more a low-grade civil war.
I wouldn't say that. No,
okay.
I'd say there was a durable but very fragile political settlement achieved in 1990 in Lebanon that the current conflict is threatening to overturn, and that's why the Lebanese government is so reluctant to move against Hezbollah, because it would most likely plunge the country into another civil war.
Okay,
but I do think a lot of Iran's foreign policy is purely ideologically driven. There's not really any geopolitical reason why Iran and Israel need to be enemies or even think about each other all that much. There's not really any strategic benefit to it for Iran, and a lot of drawback. It's very hard to understand as anything other than a pure ideological
okay, and so what is the Iranian ideology then?
Well, in some ways, I think that it doesn't make sense from an international relations foreign policy perspective, but it does make sense from an internal domestic politics perspective, because the legitimacy of and this is going to become a lot more complicated now that we don't know what's going on with the Iranian government. But up until this war, the legitimacy of the Iranian state has been on their being the defenders of the revolution, and positioning themselves as the defenders of the revolution does mean they're the ones who are opposing the U.S. and Israel. And so internally, if you can prove that you're the one protecting the nation against the U.S. and Israel, that's where you get your political power.
All right, so is this a anti-Western thing, whether political, religious, cultural, economic, or is there something else involved here?
Well, I mean, it's all those things connected. It's the role that Iran has always played, well, at least for modern history, has been as a country that tries to organize middle powers. And under the Shah, they were trying to build a coalition of middle powers that the U.S. is actually fairly comfortable with. Post-Shah Iranian Revolution, they're trying to build an explicitly anti-U.S. coalition of middle powers, or sometimes they dabble in pan-Islamism and things like that. You know, they try and export different movements, but they're still trying to build that place for themselves in the world. They don't want to be stuck. Well, during the Cold War, Iran didn't want to be stuck as a proxy of the U.S. or the Soviet Union. They still don't want to be stuck between the U.S. or Russia or China. They don't want to attach themselves to one of those coalitions necessarily, which is why discussions of China in this get so interesting. But we'll get to that when we talk about the implications.
So ideologically, they're in kind of a strange place because Shia Islam does not have a concept of a caliphate, because the true caliph's the 12th Imam, who, and according to Shia Muslims, is not dead, right? He's just being hidden until the end times. So unlike, Sunni Islamists who formed groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, they're not trying to restore the golden age of the Islamic caliphs. But at the same time, the Khomeini really developed his own kind of unique political ideology, which is called in Iran, it's called the guardianship of the jurists.
Okay.
And it basically says that it has some elements of democracy. And that kind of goes back to this sort of populist underpinnings of the revolution. But, there's, as in Sunni Islamist thought, there's a great fear with democracy, which is that the electorate might vote for something that is wrong. And therefore, the duties he saw of the Muslim cleric in politics is to prevent the electorate from voting for things that are un-Islamic.
Okay.
So that's their political system has, right? They directly elect a president to a 4-year term. Every adult can vote, but the candidates all have to be approved by what's called the Council of Guardians, which are 12 senior religious leaders that are appointed by the supreme leader.
Well, that kind of perpetuates their power, and the supreme leader, just by that term, means then he's the one with final authority then.
Absolutely. So throughout the 90s and early 2000s, and even into the Obama administration, there was a hope in some quarters that there would be some sort of reform within the system in Iran. And the problem is the system that Khomeini set up is designed to prevent any sort of fundamental reform from within the system. And so, what happened time and time again was, Parliament considered passing laws that would free it, allow for more freedom of speech, and the supreme leader vetoes them. Candidates for president that want to allow for greater freedoms get banned from running. So the possibilities for reform within the system and the hopes really for reform within the system have steadily declined until we get to, the place where we are now.
And the place where we are right now, I think, raises a lot of questions about their constitutional design, because I think a lot of those things are fundamentally broken right now. I mean, a lot of those people you're talking about who make those decisions are dead.
Yeah.
And this is, as we get into the political complications for Iran that this is causing, we're going to have to discuss this. But yeah, I think some of this conversation might need to be in the past tense.
Yeah.
Okay. So our first section is just about over. Is there any other historical context that you think we need to know?
Well, just that the Middle East has been in a balance of power between Israel and Saudi Arabia and Iran for ever since the fall of Saddam Hussein, and sometimes Turkey, sometimes Egypt. And you have to remember that these things are constantly tipping back and forth. And one other thing, and I just want to reemphasize the degree to which the legitimacy of the IRGC and the Iranian state comes from defending or fighting war, right? Like this is something that's going to be hugely important as we talk about this current conflict. But they were forged in war. They got their political identities in war, and it is like many revolutionary movements. I mean, we had some of that as well with our revolution. We think about it in the context of the Revolutionary War. You see that with France and the invasion of the outside powers. A lot of Republican revolutionary movements in history have been forged in war, and Iran is no different.
A lot of people have argued that the Iran-Iraq War saved the Islamic Republic. Yeah. Because, there were, it caused a lot of people, Iranians who were not necessarily on board with the Islamic Republic, when the alternative was being invaded by the Arab nationalist Saddam Hussein and having parts of Iran annexed to Iraq, it became a nationalist cause and not just a religious one. So, for example, a lot of military officers who had been purged after 1979 were let out of prison because they needed them. They needed people who knew how to fly planes and things like that. But also, they had a new motivation to fight for Iran that they didn't have before.
There aren't many clearer examples of the idea of war making the state, I think, than this one. Yeah.
Okay, well, good. Well, thank you. I think that's some great historical context to help us understand what's going on. And so this will be the end of part one. And with that, I will yield back the balance of my time.